Hey, you guys. Thank you so much for being here to listen to Rosie and hear some of her poems. You guys are going to love these. I'm Emily Wall. I'm Associate Professor of English here, and I've had the great pleasure of working with Rosie in several classes. I was her thesis advisor last year, which was a really kind of amazing experience for both of us, watching her put this book together and the growth that she went through. And I'm also her Eureka mentor. For those of you who don't know, that's the Undergraduate Research Award. And one thing that I'm particularly proud of with Rosie is she's one of only 2 creative writing students to have won this award. So it's kind of a big deal. And I'm a big fan of her poetry. You're going to be too. And she gave me her bio out of Tidal Echoes, which I love holding up in front of everybody anytime I can, because she was also published in this year's Tidal Echoes, and in addition was the McBaron's grant winner this year for her work. So she has piles of glory coming her way right now. I don't like writing bios, so that's why I just gave her this. Okay, so I will read this. University of Alaska Southeast School of Arts and Sciences student Rosie Ainza has resided in Juneau for over 20 years. A 2017 Eureka recipient, she spent the greater part of 2017 on the U.S.-Mexican border, retracing her family's immigration route and providing humanitarian aid to migrants. Welcome, Rosie.
Cool, thank you. Hello. So I'm an undergrad student, probably like a lot of you guys. The stuff that I'm going to be presenting on today, I'm in no way an expert of any of it. A lot of it I've just come to start to know really recently. And so when I talk about stuff, I have it written down, help with the vocabulary a little bit, and also to kind of keep on track. But it's this particular topic that I'm going to be talking about is one that I've researched a lot since, for the past couple of years. And it's something that hasn't really been worked on and researched a ton that I know of out in the great wide world. There's a couple like really, really amazing theorists and activists that talk about travel writing, and what we're going to talk about is decolonizing travel writing. But other than that, it's kind of like hey, I just heard about this and I want to share it with you guys too. So we're going to talk about what I call the truth about place, a critique on travel writing. So what I'm here to do today is share kind of a meditation on travel and the genre of travel writing as a mode of representation. During the course of the past 7 years, I've traveled like pretty extensively throughout Asia, Africa, North America, and after enrolling at UAS as an undergrad in 2013, I was introduced to some terms, imperialism, coloniality, and decolonization, a lot of which by Sol Neal and Emily Wall. So they're kind of big, heavy philosophical terms, and they weren't part of my vocabulary previously before I enrolled at UAS. So how the terms came to mean something within my own travel and creative writing is kind of why I'm here with you today. So again, I'm no expert whatsoever. So we're going to talk about, we'll just stay on this guy right here. So according to the dictionary, Merriam-Webster Dictionary, imperialism is a state policy, practice, or advocacy of extending power and dominion, especially by direct territorial acquisition or by gaining political and economic control of other areas. When I think about imperialism and colonization, I think about the rubber coming from Congo during the reign of King Leopold II. So he used to, his military leaders under his control used to demand one black hand for every bullet spent to kind of keep the bullets in check, essentially keep count, right? So one bullet for one black hand. When I think about imperialism and colonization, I think about the massacre at Sand Creek, which Professor Neely introduced me to. In Sand Creek, what's now Colorado, in 1864, Colonel Chivington and his men destroyed a village of Cheyenne and Arapaho people, most of which were women and children, and they sat peacefully under the American flag. So those are some things that I think about, some images. Today, the residue of colonization and imperialism, it allows for continued stratification of people. It perpetuates Eurocentric dominance, white supremacy, racism, ethnic cleansing, genocide, slavery, identity theft, land theft, imposed and often misunderstood treaties, cultural stereotypes, relocation, forced assimilation, government manipulation, corporate control, psychic violence. The list kind of goes on. So all associated forms of oppression that continue to impact Indigenous people and people of color. From this book called For Indigenous Minds Only, a Decolonization Handbook, the authors Rosie and Michael Yellowbird write, colonization generally refers to the process that is perpetuated after the initial control over Indigenous peoples. It's achieved through invasion and conquest. Perpetuating colonization allows the colonizers to maintain or expand their social, political, and economic power. It is detrimental because their powers come at the expense of Indigenous lands, resources, lives, and self-determination. Nelson Maldonado Torres, in On the Coloniality of Human Rights, he explains the difference between coloniality and colonialism. Coloniality is not just colonialism, he writes. When colonialism is typically considered to be a political arrangement that has existed since time immemorial, coloniality refers to the logic, culture, and structure of modern world system. So imperialism and colonization, they linger through coloniality. It impacts our communities and how many of us move about the world. So Martinique philosopher Frantz Fanon writes, imperialism leaves behind germs of rot, which we must clinically detect and remove from our land and from our minds as well. We do this through the practice of decolonization. So when we talk about decolonization, it's not just the gaining of political independence, it's the act of resisting the forces of colonialism that perpetuate the subjugation and or exploitation of minds, bodies, and lands. And it means basically the undoing of coloniality. It means the recovery and rejuvenation of pre-colonial heritage, of language tradition, with further preservation of culture ongoing. So to wrap that little vocabulary lesson up, Michael Yellowbird and Rosie urge that first and foremost, decolonization must occur in our own minds. Decolonization is not passive, but rather it requires something called praxis, which author Paulo Freire of Pedagogy of the Oppressed is a really cool book if you guys haven't checked it out. He defines praxis as reflection and action upon the world in order to transform it. So why that has to do with travel, right? Travel is a vehicle for us to explore the condition of living, how our relationships to place and people shape our experiences, how our identities and political histories inform place, how power structures inform how we migrate or how we don't migrate, and how that affects the places that we pass through. Travel can be for leisure, education, religious pilgrimages, humanitarian purposes. It can also be migration, whether chosen or forced, whether a backpacker on their gap year, a retiree on a leisurely holiday, or a refugee escaping a war-torn home nation heading to the United States in a caravan. All of these journeys are informed in some way by the entrenched attitudes of coloniality and white supremacy. So many of the things when we think of, having to do with colonialism and imperialism, they're pretty negative. A lot of really kind of hardcore messed up stuff. But when we also think about leisure and escapism, those things have roots in colonialism. Timothy Mitchell writes in Colonizing Egypt that one of the first experiences of tourism was after the British shelled the port of Alexandria, and small colonial businesses decided to start charging people for these little pleasure cruises where they would go out on boats and watch the conquest of Egypt as it unfolded. So like a live stream of it in essence. So to bring all of that forward into today, activist and author Bonnie Moore, she's definitely the one that I found is most active in talking about decolonizing travel writing. She writes, leisure travel is all about escape and indulgence, which to the Western tourist can seem kind of harmless, but consider the dichotomy between what is being escaped and what is being escaped to. So moving forward to the topic of travel writing. So the genre, it encompasses outdoor literature, guidebooks, novels, nature writing, travel memoirs, blogs, everything, so on. I found a quote from a travel blogger, not a very famous guy, just a random quote on travel writing. He says, travel writing highlights the differences in manners and customs around the world, helping the reader to understand other people and places. And it helps readers plan their own trips and avoid costly mistakes while traveling. Totally simple, like pretty inane, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about master narratives and the dominant narrator. To preface a lot of these writers and travelers, I'm a fan of. Anthony Bourdain, he just recently passed away. He's probably one of my favorite authors and personalities ever. You see Hunter S. Thompson there, Ernest Hemingway, and a lot of more, more recent contemporary. And then my one lone female at the top, Elizabeth Gilbert, who wrote Eat, Pray, Love. So this collage, I didn't just hand pick who I wanted to put. This collage came from lists and websites of basically the most famous, the most acclaimed travel writers on the planet. Most of them are British, American. I think we have a couple Australians up there too, maybe one Canadian and a French guy. So Bonnie Moore, she posits who travels more than people of color, right? Whether it's because we wanted to or had to, or whatever the case may be, since the dawn of people of color have been migrating. Before civilization began, before our lives were discovered, before Lonely Planet and couch surfing and Airbnb, we've been traveling. Yet voices of people of color are drowned out by the whiteness of the genre. It's either from the conquistadors' field notes to the vastly commercial industry that travel writing is today. The tradition of travelers' tales is deeply rooted in the period of imperial expansion in Europe. It's closely linked to colonialism, coloniality, and what I call scientific racism via early anthropology. Travel writing, like early anthropology, has long provided evidence of white superiority through its representation of the exotic as lascivious, barbaric, or just simply other. Relationships between travel writing and decolonization, particularly in the second half of the 20th century through today, remain relatively unexplored. So we're going to talk a little bit about roles and labels. Here I am. This is in Kenya at the Southern Cross Academy. So this slide, I'm going to talk about the role of the savior, right? So in a 2017 article in the Journal of Critical Thought and Praxis, Brittany Aronson writes, in 2012, Nigerian-American author Tehu Cole coined the term white savior or industrial complex, which is kind of heady, but it refers to a big emotional experience that validates privilege. Ultimately, people are rewarded from saving those less fortunate and are able to completely disregard the policies they have supported that have created and or maintained systems of oppression. The rhetoric around how Americans often talk about Africa as a continent of chaos, impoverished, HIV-infected communities, war-hungry people, it situates these countries as places in need of heroism. I mean, how many times have we known somebody to reference Africa, like as in a country, essentially, right? It happens a lot more than I think people even give any mind to. So what this mindset of the savior does is it perpetuates the need for external forces to come in and save the day. But what gets left out of the conversation are the roles that colonialism and white supremacy have had in creating these conditions in the first place. So distorted narratives that paint Africa and other developing countries in these ways allow for the hegemonic project of whiteness and white supremacy to do exactly what it intended, which is create this this need for white intervention, right? In order for the emotional needs of the privilege to be satisfied. So the argument is framed in such a common sense manner that any opposition to a white savior coming in to save the day is deemed in a negative light, right? Like, who wouldn't want to bring soccer balls and toothbrushes to, an orphanage outside of Nairobi? Soccer ball, indestructible, from One World, One Ball. Toothbrushes from Nolan Davis, a local dentist. So since 2012, I've spent about a year or so total in Africa, particularly Kenya. And I was introduced by my husband to a school and orphanage in Nairobi called Agape Hope Children's Center. It's a Christian establishment, but neither of us identify as religious. But each time we visit, our primary reason is to go as teachers, right? The center relies on volunteers to do everything. They don't have much. So we teach everything from science to PE. I've taught a sex ed class, but our main subject is English, right? It should be noted that upon their release from British colonial rule in 1963, English is the official language of Kenya, though there remains a vast number of indigenous and tribal languages, and each individual and special in their aesthetic value. So there's a book by Mukomawa Ngiti. He wrote it in 1986, but a lot of it's still relevant. It's called Decolonizing the Mind. It demonstrates the way Western cultural and linguistic superiority are emphasized while African cultures and languages are debased. And 32 years later, so this year, he wrote an article for Lit Hub magazine. He talks about history moves on, theories of liberation march alongside it. But without our languages, we remain trapped within the English metaphysical empire. So we see a lot of resurgence of indigenous language here at UAS, right here in the Kitani. But it should be noted that, when we travel to these, foreign countries and these other places, that they have indigenous language too. So what does that mean for us as people who want to go travel abroad and be English teachers? That's something that's pretty easy. You can get your TEFL certification and go pretty much anywhere. There's a lot of places that need a lot of help. So for me as an English teacher abroad, when I travel, this information that I've shared with you is really imperative in moving towards decolonization. So the work of linguistic decolonization, as one example of decolonization, it can't be done by writers and teachers alone. African and other indigenous languages have to move from being primarily social languages to vehicles of political, cultural, and economic growth. So now the time I spend learning and teaching with my friends in Kenya has become centered around promoting creative writing curriculum with the element of translation to mother tongue being a central idea. But, again, I'm an undergrad student. I'm just learning a little steps. As for the soccer balls and the toothbrushes and the clothing drives, when I return to Kenya, I'll still be carrying extra bags, but I'll also be carrying the knowledge that I've shared with you today. So we're going to talk about authentic, which is the next. Sweet, really doing good on time. Authentic. So how many people do we know that have said that we want to go somewhere where nobody else has gone before, right? That they want something authentic. When you travel, or you want to go somewhere where maybe you might be one of the first white people to be seen by X people and X community. And maybe we'll go home and write a book about it, or maybe we'll get a sweet contract or however the ad thing works on blogs and get paid for it, right? Get paid to travel. How cool would that be? I've thought about it. How many times have we said that ourselves? I can name quite a few times I've heard, about that secret beach, and only to find 500 Australians have heard about that secret also. And then I'm so pissed because I don't get, the authentic experience. And to want privacy and solitude, especially for us as Alaskans, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing that perpetuates coloniality about that. But when we think about it, in terms of when we visit another country, that we're somehow allowed that's just an affirmation of our supremacy. These are pictures I've taken myself, and a lot of them highlight some of the stuff I talk about that maybe we shouldn't be doing or shouldn't be thinking. And it's kind of just a way to articulate to you guys that I'm not here, it's like preaching from a pulpit about you shouldn't do this and you shouldn't do that. I mean, these are things that I do and I've done and I actively think about. So authentic as an imperial term doesn't allow for cultural dynamism. I really like that term. Cultures are dynamic, right? However, a lot of the times in tourist climates, the locals come to understand the static dance of authenticity for the tourist. Static in their particular cultural movement, what we think of the space and culture in a make-believe mind map. You think we live here where there's cruise ships coming and they want, I helped run a whale watching company this past summer. And when I'm down on the docks, people say off the cruise ships, they're like, oh, you've got black hair. Are you a local? Like, are you really a local, like a native? Just like, no, I've lived here for like 20 years. And they're like, gosh, where are the natives? Nobody lives here that's from here. You have black hair. And it's like something that's like a constant daily conversation. And that's not to say that the people that are coming off of the cruise ships are ignorant, right? They're just, what they're doing is they're thinking about the culture where they visit as static in their little make-believe mind map. So some other terms that, we use and we might not use with, negativity behind are terms like gypsy or tribal, colorful, to discover somewhere. They're just kind of more examples of the, lexicon of coloniality, if you will, within travel culture and travel writing. It's something that when I was researching to talk to you guys today, going through like Instagram and looking at like all the hashtags and stuff, like those are really, really, really common tropes and common words used when looking at this type of genre. So we might go into these places or make ourselves a temporary part of the culture with great intentions. There's always the traveler versus tourist mindset. Jamaica Kincaid, in A Small Place, she writes about the ugly tourist. And hopefully I'll pull a quote from her, but if you guys haven't read A Small Place by Jamaica Kincaid, especially coming from Juneau, living in Juneau, it's one that you'll be like, oh my gosh, like I totally relate to this, both as the ugly tourist and as the local. So we go into these places, right, with great intentions, and maybe we go as somebody who uses the term woke, or maybe we consider ourselves feminists. But as Bonnie and Moore writes, there's nothing feminist about taking selfies with Maasai women struggling to hold on to their dignity in the face of exploitative tourist practices. She furthers this by saying it's not the color of the skin of the authors, which, I threw around the word white a lot. It's not the color of the skin of the authors, but the entitled language they employ that usually shuts her out. Like an untouched gem of a beach ruined by tourists, modern day travel writing has become overrun with listicles, fluff, and a flagrant case of unchecked privilege. If there exists a colonized genre of writing, this is it. Travel writing's it. Writers of color aren't off the problematic hook either. She writes, because some of us tend to mimic the dominant narrator's voice instead of using our own. I get it. Bills need to be paid. We land on foreign soil and record our first impressions, which always lack content. What would happen if we were to reclaim a genre when the subjects of travel narratives, like the noble savages or the smiling Orients, the perpetual others, what if they were to grab the mic, avail what agency we have, and flip the single story or that master narrative to centralize our own experiences? And what if we were recognized as the experts of our homelands and of ourselves? So that's kind of that's kind of it for that part. So right now I'm going to go on to kind of how I thought about decolonizing travel writing by finding the colonizer within myself and my own writing. So this is a little picture of a little manuscript that I made. So 2017, I think it was actually fall semester of 2016. I'm in a class with Emily, and she goes, "You guys, you got to apply for this Eureka grant. It's so cool." And we're like, "It's for science majors. Like, what are you talking about? Research? What kind of research can, a writer, a humanities person do? I don't have, the other kind of, the empirical data and stuff like that." But she's like, "No, go for it." So over the past couple years, starting, a little bit before then, I sort of began to seek a new understanding of humanity and heritage through, all of the learning that I've done through my many, many years as an undergraduate student here. I began to look at my own disinherited biological roots, of course, albeit from the subject position of a relatively privileged, cis, hetero, bicultural Latina who can pass as white. But I was really thrilled at the opportunity that, that UAS afforded with the Eureka grant. So what I did was I pitched an idea to retrace my father's family's immigration route from Sonora in northern Mexico to San Diego, where I was born. And then the product of this research trip, at the end, I would write a manuscript of poetry to present as my undergraduate thesis. And I did that at the end of last year. And today I'm going to share a little bit of it with you. This, as you guys know, I don't know how many of you are writers or English majors or creative writing majors. Maybe you'd have the BLA, but for me, poetry and your writing is always a draft, right? For me, it's constant revision. Even if you're like, "Okay, I'm done. Look at how beautiful. Thanks, capital copy." And then, you pick it up like almost a year later after I presented it, and I'm like, "Man, first draft." But this is what I have for you guys. It is so funny because after the past year, I went back down to the border this past fall to kind of look at, when I was there last year, all of the detention centers were still really, really under the rug. And since they've been in the media more, I went down there to talk to more people again and see how the atmosphere of the, border towns on both sides has changed. And it's changed a lot. And I think my interpretation of a lot of the poems that I wrote in here has changed a lot. Like I see myself, I see my colonizer in some of my writing in here. So it's just like a constant, we're constantly revising ourselves as well as our writing. So to preface, what I did when I was just talking to you guys is I dismissed the nomenclature as authentic as a tourist branding, essentially. Yet the search for intimacy and belonging and closure, it's all really a major part of the quest for authenticity. So I think for me, when I first began this Eureka Project, I tended to romanticize my bloodlines. Like growing up in Licatani, I found love and appreciation for indigeneity and indigenous ways of knowing and the language, I'm a portion Native North American on my father's side. And according to the research that I've done, it's part of the Tohono O'odham Nation, which is originally known as Papago and Sonora. They live a cross-border existence. Their nation's located in southern Arizona on the Tohono O'odham Reservation, and then also in northern Sonora in Mexico. I thought that was a really good kind of image because so many of us live at the crossroads of multiple identities, multiple cultures. We've become more and more, a nation of more than one culture, which I think is wonderful. But so, when I look at my tiny little baby roots in indigenous North American culture, I also have to look at when Spain colonized Mexico, one of the objectives of the crown was to convert as many indigenous people as they could to Catholicism. This, along with what they called mestizaje, which is the mixing of Spaniards and the indigenous population, led to an essential, social blending. With that, it's to romanticize being a Spaniard, it's kind of a neat idea until you think of what conquistadors came and actually did here. So I knew after embarking on this research project that walking in the footsteps of my ancestors, yet denying that they didn't benefit from systematic violence, would just be me furthering the perpetuation of coloniality. And going into it, authenticity is bound up in questions of the real. The resistance and or appropriation of it depends on where and how it's sought. So Bonnie and Moore, again, she's so cool. If I have a little bit of time, maybe I'll play you a little bit of a video of hers, but if not, BANI space AMOR. It's her. You should check it out. She has amazing stuff. She does a lot of photo essays, just really trying to flip the script on travel writing. So she talks about vulnerability, how blending memoir is one step in the decolonization of travel writing genre. It's not the solution, but it's a step. And I tried to incorporate a lot of this into my manuscript. So I'm going to read a couple poems. And then we'll have a little bit of time to talk. I hope to talk and maybe get some insight from you guys, maybe some travel stories or something like that I think would be really cool. Let me just see. Cool. So I'm going to read a little bit and then I'll talk just a little bit about each one of these poems and why I thought that they were kind of important in talking about looking at how to decolonize my own travel writing. So this one's called Pochos. Daddy makes tamales for Christmas, goes to the butcher to buy the meat. La la la, the butcher says, all fast in Espanol. Dad gets red and so do I. Can't understand much, so we laugh, give answers in English and broken Spanish. Cat got your tongue? Gato, gato, pinche gato. Pocho means rotten fruit, and a Mexican who's not fluent in Spanish. Daddy's a pocha and I'm a pocha. In Spanish, the end of nouns shift depending on gender. I know that from class and from films and from the barrio where I lived when I was a kid, where the cholos rolled their R's and the aunties fed us arroz. But sometimes I forget the rest. So that's one. Kind of going into that a little bit. When my dad came up from Mexico to Southern California in the early 60s, he was a part of a pretty wealthy family, child of pretty wealthy parents. And they moved to a really, really, a nice, super nice for them neighborhood. And they joined the country club. And they were, specifically forbade from speaking Spanish in the house. And a lot of them were kind of more lighter skinned, so they could pass as being Spanish. And today, my grandpa, who's 93, he still tells people he's Spanish instead of Mexican. So, growing up, my parents, they're bilingual, but my mom, who's here today, who's Caucasian, she speaks way better Spanish than my dad. Which is not something to necessarily laugh about, but it's always funny in our household. So this one, I didn't mark it, but this is called In Tijuana. So in Tijuana, there is a smell that hovers like atmosphere just across the rusted fence. I take the road that parallels. I drive slow with windows open, heading west to east. I smell open sewer, marigolds in November, campasuchil and sugar skulls, and 1,000 tortillas. The smell of fresh graffiti, vivid, its aroma inviting like nopales or the blood of a snake in the mouth of an eagle, atlan. The smell of a shakedown, metallic like corruption, and loose change on dashboards that you transfer to the pockets of Los Federales. But I don't mind. It's the kind of smell that makes pups whine for their mother, the aroma of comfort, and I am eased by it, the way I felt as a kid when I'd hear my mother's voice call from upstairs, "Darling, it's time to wake up." This is a picture I took along the border. This is Imperial Beach in San Diego, and there's the fence marching right out into the ocean. So a lot of times, you know, when we find our own ways of decolonizing the writer within and decolonizing travel writing, a lot of it, you look at your own bloodlines and you look at your family. And I think for me, you know, growing up, I was 8 when we moved to Alaska. So we moved up here and all of the family stayed behind in Southern California. But I think looking back and finding some connection to heritage through even imagination, I think can be really important when working through our own writing. So this one's, my cultural epigraphs lie with my grandmother. Her manicured bones are in a manicured cemetery 15 minutes from here, but I hear them in the Vietnamese chatter at my nail salon because I saw her manicured hands at a quinceañera in a photo once. I smell her bones in the acrylic, in the acetone. I see her bones cloaked in the red velvet of Virgin de Guadalupe on $2 prayer candles at the corner store and in strange talismans gifted to Santissimo Muerte in the middle of West Texas. I feel her bones in the wood grain of strange pews beneath my thighs. I hear them in the rustle of thin pages or whispered psalms, but I don't know what she tastes like because I've never taken sacrament. I've never known the curing rain of holy water. I see her bones when I settle my body in places like Rattlesnake Wash and Arroyo Hondo, and it's hot out. I feel her at the base of the steel fence that separates mine from yours, and in the barren solitude of Pascua Pueblo, and in my solitude, but sometimes I can't feel her at all. My connection of passing thunderhead. I tripped over that one a little bit. This is my grandpa, Al, and that's my grandma, who I talk about a lot. She died when I was really young. So I just remember her from little kind of like childhood vignettes of visits and whatnot. And I think what's important is even though they assimilated, you know, to the dominant culture here in America, even though they kind of turned their back on their mother tongue, they still hold within them, just like we do, the roots of our heritage. And I think that was one really major thing that I found moving through my project. So I think I might read one more for you guys. I haven't picked out which one yet, but then we'll talk a little bit. I'll open it up for discussions. We'll have a couple minutes. I think this is a good one. Cool. So, sorry, I'm looking right now. I haven't picked out which one. There's a lot of them I don't like anymore. A lot of them are just like, oh, I don't know, man. But I guess, okay, I'll open it to this one. You know, I talked about a little bit about my time, my work in Kenya, going there in the white savior industrial complex. When I was doing my Eureka Project, I don't have a picture for it, but I'll go to one of the places I was. See, that's the fence marching along, kind of like a steel snake. So when I was doing my work, a lot of it was talking to people, along these border towns on both sides. They used to be economically dependent on one another. There's so many of these border towns along the US-Mexico border that have the same name, like Nogales and Nogales, or where their names interchange, Calexico and Mexicali, right? So part of my project was not just looking at my own family, but also looking at just what it's like to be a product and be a part of these border towns, and look at the decline of the economies and the decline of the kinship between these border towns. So while I was there, I did a number of things, working with a couple really cool organizations called Humane Borders out of Tucson and Border Angels out of San Diego. And they do a lot of stuff. They do like pro bono legal services. They do a lot of like migrant labor outreach. And they also, Humane Borders along the Arizona-Mexico border, they patrol and man a lot of water stations for migrant border crossers. There's a big argument, especially now, but a big argument that's like, you're just, perpetuating the illegal immigrants coming through, but, it's a humanitarian issue. Even though, after our president was elected, the number of illegal migrants that were captured went down, but the number of bodies ending up in the desert didn't falter at all. That remained the same. So I helped a lot I didn't help a lot. I just did what I could with this particular group, Humane Borders, filling water stations, and I wrote a poem about it. It's called "The Things We Carry." I see a backpack in the desert, overturned disaster, cereal in the sand, a shoe without a foot, money and milk powder. John Doe or Fulano de Tal, is he a father or son? I say a prayer to Santísima Muerte, bendice mi dia, bendice mi suerte. My guilt is heavy. We made it across before walls, before wetback, tonk, alien, illegal. When schools had funding for English tutors and your neighbors brought you apple pie. I don't know what I owe, so I fill plastic jugs, carry a hose on a flatbed truck, on unnamed roads, hoping to quench a thirst so that we can carry on walking, to go to work, to plant seeds in the ground, in our heads. Amor no tiene fronteras, which means love has no borders. So that's it. I have like a couple minutes to talk to you guys. Did any of this stuff seem like kind of like relevant? Maybe? Do I have any travelers in here at all? Any people who like to hustle in the summertime and maybe spend a semester either taking classes, not on campus, the e-learning classes? That's what I did the first year. I spent some time in Southeast Asia. I was taking some classes distance. Does anybody have any questions about what I taught? I know I covered a lot. Any questions at all? Cool. Thank you guys for, what's that? I'm sorry. I don't want to force them. I'm like, come on, ask a question.
Did you always know you were going to write poetry specifically, or how did you choose that?
No, I know, Emily, do we have some of your students in here? Cool, okay, awesome. She told me that some of you guys might be in here. So when I was 29, 30, I decided to re-enroll in university. I had not taken that many classes before. So as a more non-traditional learner, when I came back in to a university setting, I decided that I wanted to get a degree in something that interested me. Like, I have enough work experience under my belt. I can always fall back on working for the state or bartending or whatever. Like, I'm going to be paying for this out of my own pocket. And, and I care about grades now and doing cool stuff. with academics. So I decided to do a BLA with a designated emphasis in English and creative writing. And then through just taking, all of the general ed requirements, it kind of fell into poetry. So when I pitched my Eureka Project, not thinking at all that I would be selected, I'm like, this is weird. I don't know about this. It just fell into place. Poetry in particular, for me, you can write so much in so little. And I think that's the most important thing, especially when we look at really broad, heavy, kind of almost confusing at times topics like heritage and, all of that kind of stuff. So that's why I chose poetry. Cool, that's a good question. So for those of you that are Emily students now that might be, not a 7th year senior like me, I would say, please go out there and try and get the Eureka grant. I think it's such a cool opportunity. I would never, ever, ever have even thought about doing this, research trip and actually making something out of it if it hadn't been for Eureka. So, any other questions, Dylan?
I'm curious. Since I've never heard of travel writing in poetry form before. Are there any other people who sort of did that, or were you just
Oh man,
venturing off into that?
it's a really good question. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I know that there's a lot. Do you have any answers to that? I guess to answer, I mean, so much of my favorite writing, my favorite poetry in general has to do with place and geography and atmosphere. Like Neruda, for example, he's kind of, he's a well-known one. So I think that reading about place and reading about that, I think that that's as much travel writing to me as Anthony Bourdain and Hemingway and stuff. Yeah. Because we can be tourists and travelers in our own hometowns and our own space too. You don't have to go to Kenya, to feel these things and to start to look at decolonizing and finding the colonizer within. Yes.
I think I mentioned this last week in our BLA class.
Yeah.
When you shared this with us, but I feel like it's really important for individuals to look at their own families really specifically and where they came from to really gain a sense of place.
Mm-hmm.
Today, I didn't grow up in Juneau, I grew up in Utah, and I can tell you that there's not a lot of connection to the indigenous people there where I grew up.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing like the representation that is here in Juneau, comparatively speaking. And I can say that now that I've come back to school, similarly as you, older and have more reason to be here and way more aware of the information that I'm learning and applying it to the world around me, I've discovered so much about who I am and where I came from. It's basically a vestige of a Mormon pioneer family, how little I have in common with where I'm from. Envious I am of people who have a real connection to where they're from. And I think that's neat that you use your own heritage to discover this information.
I think that's a really good point. We want to look at oh man, how are we authentic, or how do we belong in certain places? But, just looking at the colonizer within our own writing and me looking at my conquistador heritage, there's my 5th great whatever times 5 great grandpa, he discovered the overland route from Sonora to what's now San Francisco, right? But then his dad was murdered by a bunch of, very right to do so Apaches. It's crazy. It's so crazy. But I think you have to look at it. You have to be okay with knowing your own heritage, just warts and all. I think that's really important. That way we don't romanticize who we are or romanticize the other. That's a good point. Cool. I think we're probably got to wrap it up. Thank you, guys.
Thanks for
Thanks for sharing your time.
If y'all want to leave feedback, I have 7 feedback forms.
Thank you, Eli.
Yeah, thank you.